afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
No, my friend kind of
Alright.
She's like, all right.
So good afternoon and welcome to our first lecture on this spring semester, which is otherwise lined up with events. So if you haven't done so already, please take our spring events flyer at the entrance to this room. My name is Badema Pitik. I'm the Visual History Archive Research Officer at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And today I have a great pleasure of introducing our speaker, Ioanida Costache. But first, let me thank our donors, Gerald Breslauer, Mickey Rotman, Tammy Anderson, and Sharon DeGrive, whose generous support enabled us to offer this important fellowship. I would also like to thank USC Thornton School of Music, and especially Professor Nick Strimple, thanks to whose generosity we are together co-sponsoring our event today. So now a bit about Ioanida. Ioanida Costache is a is a PhD candidate in music at Stanford University. She's our 2019-2020 Breslauer, Ratman, and Anderson Research Fellow, and she just spent a month in residence at the center conducting research with the testimonies. And today's talk is based on that research and also is part of a bigger dissertation project she's currently conducting. She's in her writing phase, I think, and her dissertation is entitled Sounding Romani, Sonic Subjectivity, Counterhistory, Identity Formation, and Affect in Romanian Roma Music. Before starting her graduate school studies, Ioanida earned her BA from Amherst College, where she earned the Michigan Prize for Best Senior Thesis on a musical topic. Her work has recently been published in Critical Romani Studies, and she's also the recipient of a number of important awards and fellowships, including ASEEES Dissertation Research Grant and Fulbright US Grant to Romania. She presented her work at many national and international conferences, and she recently participated in the Jack and Anita Hess faculty seminar at USC Japan. So please join me in welcoming Ioanida today.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Badema. Before I launch into my talk today, I wanted to say a word of thanks to everyone at the Institute for not only choosing my application so I could spend a month here, but also for a wonderful time spent researching and wonderful conversations with everyone at the Institute. So thank you, everyone who's in the audience. And thank you all for coming. Hearing is an event. It is something that happens to us as an unavoidable process. In hearing something, we are passive agents. We encounter sound and perceive it, whether or not we intend to. Listening, on the other hand, is an action. We listen as active agents. Listening is not something that happens to us. Rather, it is something we choose to enact consciously and willfully. What I hope to do in the next 30 minutes is first help this audience understand the nuances and perils regarding the widespread lack of knowledge of the Romani Holocaust. And secondly, I'd like to offer a framework of critical listening to that problem so that we as a society might learn how to better listen for the Roma. A few weeks ago, Dan Pavel Dogi, chief of the ODI HR contact point for Roma and Sinti issues, spoke on UN News Radio on the occasion of Holocaust Remembrance Day last month. I will quote Dogi at length as he summarizes the core issues facing society in coming to terms with the Romani Holocaust. He says, "There is still an issue with proper recognition of the Roma Holocaust, often called the forgotten Holocaust, because it's not widely known, and both states and historians and scholars, they were not very open to document the situation, acknowledge the suffering of Roma and their experience as being an integral part of the Holocaust. Even now, there's the definition which focuses primarily on Jews and any other group is mentioned secondarily. Within the Roma community, this hurts, because we always believed that what happened to Roma, what happened to us, is an integral part of the Holocaust. And I mentioned today that it's time for justice for Roma to be done, and maybe that Holocaust definition to be corrected and amended to properly reflect the Roma as being part of the Holocaust, end quote. I want to problematize the discourse surrounding the history and remembrance of the Romani Holocaust. The Nazis and their allies murdered close to 1.5 million Roma people during the Holocaust. Yet the Romani Holocaust is often treated secondarily in museums, exhibits, and academic work. The current discourse frames the lack of awareness as the unknown genocide of the Roma, or the forgotten Holocaust. These labels lack agents. Who is forgetting? Who does not know? These are important questions to answer as we attempt to remedy this problem. Discourse around the Romani Holocaust also frames the lack of knowledge of Romani persecution as a result of a culture of silence, which similarly inaccurately portrays the suppression of this history as a nameless, faceless, agentless cultural phenomenon, when in reality the silencing has had many agents. As historian Michelle Kelso summarizes, quote, in many Eastern European countries, Holocaust perpetration and collaborationism were obscured during communism, coming to light after its collapse and remaining a politically sensitive topic deeply connected to the concepts of nationhood, end quote. Thus, totalitarian regimes instilled fear in survivors of speaking out. It is entirely understandable that a traumatized people, like the Roma, would shy away from speaking about their experience for fear of repeated persecution. What is more difficult to understand is the silencing, creating conditions in which Romani survivors were unable to speak due to power imbalances and epistemic inequality, sanctioned Roma memory from public discourse. This formulation, culture of silence, unfairly puts the onus on victims of a traumatic history who are silent to, quote, break the silence with their speech. The problem here should instead be posed as a culture of silencing, which effectively inverts the responsibility on those in positions of power to cultivate instead a culture of listening. The responsibility to speak out about silenced history should lie in large part with majority society. Speaking should not be expected from vulnerable, traumatized community. This, of course, brings up complicated questions of what Linda Alcoff has termed, quote, the problem of speaking for others, end quote. However, what I'm suggesting here is not that that non-Roma should speak on behalf of the Romani community or on behalf of survivors. Rather, majority society should recognize that the history of the Romani Holocaust belongs to us all, and it is a history we should all know. All are charged with the responsibility to be speaking out about it and breaking the silence. Romani survivors have done their part in being willing to tell their stories through testimony like that we find in the VHA. Once we learn how to listen to them, we are all tasked with carrying that memory forward. As I spent these last few weeks listening to Romani survivor testimony, I watched in awe as survivors enacted the difficult labor of recollecting trauma. Instead of pondering what drove them to recount, I took their act to bear witness to unbelievable horror as a call to listen critically, without a research agenda, but to simply bear witness alongside a survivor's memory. I would like to turn now to the task of laying out a framework for critical listening that might guide renewed recognition to this muted, distorted, ignored, and largely unheard Romani Holocaust. To do so, I present and close read, or close listen, to 4 case studies from the VHA, the Visual History Archive, in which we can listen through the archive to access traumatic experience of the Roma Holocaust. Each example offers a different form of listening, as each case requires us as listeners to tune into different dimensions of testimony. The first clip I will play is from a Jewish survivor, Dina Gottliebova Babbitt. So let's listen to Dina.
Then I went to get another girl, and that was Céline. And she was French, the Belgian French. And we became friends, we started talking. And she had this, not just sad, but totally wistful, empty look about her. And I said, are you sick? Is something wrong? And she said, my baby died. I said, how old was it? Maybe she said 2 months old, and it died. I couldn't feed it. I didn't have any milk. It starved to death. It's gone. We were hardly able to speak. She didn't speak much German, and I didn't speak any French at that time. But we did get things across, you know. And then I asked her if I can do anything for her, because I think she looked sick. And she said, well, I have terrible diarrhea. I can't hold that black bread. I can't eat that. And everything that I ate so far just goes right out of me. So the next time Mengele sent somebody to bring lunch for me, I asked to bring some food. You know, so I said, could I have white bread, please? And so I got white bread every day, which I gave to Céline, and it helped her a little. And then I asked her if she knows a certain song. J'attendrai, that was one French song I knew. J'attendrai les jours et la nuit, j'attendrai toujours ton retour. And I couldn't go any further. I said, what are the words after that? And she said, I don't know either. J'attendrai, da, da, da. We were wondering what J'attendrai was all about. And I kept pressing her, and finally she said, okay. Dans ton pas si court et en battant tristement, j'attendrai toujours. Now, these are words meaning to wait not so shortly is annoying. She was making him laugh, you know. Later on, I found, when I heard the song, I found out that she was making up words to please me, you know. And she was having a little fun with me. So that was Céline, and then I said, did she ever dance? Does she know any gypsy dances? And so she got up and she started just barely turning around, and then she sat down again, and I realized it was a stupid thing to ask her. And so I painted her. It occurred to me that she was so beautiful in a fine, delicate way. The first girl was beautiful but not delicate, but she was so like a porcelain doll, and I thought with that blue scarf she wore, I make her look like a Madonna. And I took the scarf, I untied it, and I draped it around her head like that. And then Mengele came in, and he said, yeah, but I want the ear. And he took the scarf and put it behind her ear, so she had to tie it back again. And that's why she is the Madonna with the ear, as they say. And now when I'm painting it, if I get her right this time, in oil, I'm going to do her the way I wanted to do her, without the ear, like in Madonna. The gypsies now call her the Gypsy Madonna. So, so much for Céline. Well, that was one friend I made. Since Mengele pushed that blue kerchief back to see her ear, I would like to make Céline the way I wanted to make her. I wanted to make her like a real Madonna. Also, I was toying with an idea, but I'm not sure that I'm going to do that, of making a larger background and putting some trees and things that she might never have seen again, and that she may, you know, it's stupid, you know, it's sort of it's a sentimental thought, you know, to surround her, like some of the painters sometimes put little doodles around in the background. I would like to doodle some of the things that she never saw again, because after I finished painting her, 2-3 weeks later, she was dead. So she never got to see normal life. She never got to see another tree, another flower, anything. So maybe and putting it in a picture, I still don't achieve anything. I don't know.
Two weeks after Dina painted Celine for Mengele, Celine was gassed along with other Roma from the Zigeunerlager in Auschwitz on August 2nd, 1944. Who was Celine? We may never have known Celine's name or of her existence had it not been for listening to Dina's testimony. Dina paints a portrait of Celine, both with her paintbrush and with her words. In listening through Dina's memory, we are hearing fragments of a Romani subjectivity emanating. Dina's testimony demonstrates the power of listening through friendship. The next example is of Lena Jackson, who recounts anti-Roma prejudice she experienced as a Sinti girl in Germany.
Were you able to go to school?
Yeah, I went to school.
What city was that in?
But they were telling me,
What city? Where did you go to school in?
I went to Berlin,
And what were they telling you?
making jokes. You know.
What did they say?
Well, in German there is a thing, they say, Sick, Sack, Zigeunerpack, für 5 Pfennig blieben Tabak, für 5 Pfennig Kohlen, Zigeuner haben gestohlen.
What does that mean?
Well, they always said the gypsy was stealing, you know. But I mean, there are different Mexicans, different gypsies, you know, they're different in everything. But we never stole anything in our life. My mother would have really let me have it if I would have. So
this what they said to you was kind of a mean thing to gypsies?
yeah.
Did they?
A sing-songy children's rhyme contains a painful history of anti-Roma prejudice in Lena's life. Decades later, Lena remembers every word of this hurtful rhyme, which demonstrates the power hurtful words have, as this rhyme was seared into Lena's memory. She recites it with no hesitation, as if just yesterday she was taunted by this chant intoning racist stereotypes. The childlike, simple melody of this chant belies the deeply seated white supremacist ideology the song contains, an ideology that targeted Roma and continues to target them today. In this case, in critically listening to Lena, we become attuned to the injurious nature of stereotypes of the Roma. The song represents latent anti-Roma sentiment, but takes on a completely different meaning in the context of a Roma Holocaust testimony. Listening critically to Lena teaches us how seemingly banal stereotypes and misconceptions, othering and orientalization, are part of a racist ideology that are deeply embedded in society. Lena describes in her testimony how she was deported to Auschwitz with her family. She describes starvation and violence she experienced there and at other concentration camps she was transferred to. Thus, when we close listen to Lena's testimony, we hear a through line being drawn between banal evil and horrific genocide. In the next clip, we hear Emilie, and she is a Czech Romani survivor.
Chayori Romani Ioi Kermange Iagori Natiki Nabari Ioi Charaftro
In her interview, Emilia talks about her musician family, and the interviewer then asks her to sing something. She smiles somewhat incredulously that she would be asked to sing, and then in a raspy mezzo-soprano, Emilia belts out this song. I recognized the melody immediately. It is one of the oldest Romani Czech songs called Chayori Romani, which is Romanesque for Roma girl. 2 Holocaust songs from Czechoslovakia were set to the melody from this popular Czech Romani folk song. The most well-known song of the 2 is Andoro Tabaris. The song text records the experience of the Roma during the Holocaust. The lyrics read, "In the camp, oh, I do hard work. I eat nothing. I drink nothing. Oh, I work in misery." So let's hear a version of this song. And it's the same melody that Emilia sings. Through the dissemination of Holocaust songs, which use the melody from the song Emilia sings, the melody itself in the context of this testimony carries forward memory of the Holocaust, as the meaning of the text becomes inextricably linked to the melody of the song. In the final testimony that I'll play today, we hear a Polish Romani survivor, Agnieszka Siwak. During her testimony, she pauses to invite her family into the room to play a Romani song called Mamo Mamo, or Mother Mother.
Moje synowie i dzień i wnuk zagrają nam i zaśpiewają po cygańsku. Cygańskie piosenki. Zespół, cygański zespół.
I don't speak Polish, and I don't know what the song means in a literal sense, but I do know what it means as an artifact of a culture that was almost destroyed, erased, or made impossible to exist, along with the bodies of its performers. The people in that room would not exist if the Nazis had succeeded. This music would not exist. So what does it mean that they still play? That they still sing. What I see in this clip is life conquering death. The music means survival, resistance, life. It is an act of resistance to erasure. Continuing to play Romani music is a proclamation against the ideology intent on cultural and metaphysical and corporeal and physical death. As an ethnomusicologist, I'm interested in both what music says, which I'll continue to research in the case of this song, but also in what music does. What is this mother thinking as she listened to her children play the music that embodies their cultural heritage, their identity? What was the music doing in that room? What was it doing on the magnetic tape the camcorder was etching it into? And what was it doing on my screen? In each instance, musical performance enacted embodied resistance of Romani subjectivity. Every act of intextualized creation, like musical practice, is an act of resistance, and a resistance to erasure and to the power structures that attempt to sublimate them. In listening critically to this musical testimony, we ask, what does it mean to listen to the remains of a culture that was on the brink of extinction? How does that, or should that, change our engagement with the music? My sonic and in some ways ethnographic encounter with the Roma victims of the Holocaust in the archive, who have been heretofore ignored and unheard, gives me the opportunity to develop theories of subaltern listening and deploy critical listening as an antidote to silencing. Kathy Caruth's pioneering work in trauma studies opens up new ways of conceiving of the power of testimony. She states that, quote, "The attempt to gain access to a traumatic history is the project of listening beyond the pathology of individual suffering to the reality of a history that in its crisis can only be perceived in unassimilable forms," end quote. Her reference to unassimilable forms speaks to the constant tension between the clear impossibility of understanding the trauma, but the necessity to bear witness nonetheless. She shows us how literature has the ability to bear witness to trauma when immediate understanding fails to apprehend individual or collective suffering. Building on Caruth and other literary theorists as well, we can extend their claims about the power of close reading literature to the oral realm, both in close listening to musical and oral testimony more generally. The oral encodes a suffering that is not part of dominant historical narratives, and attending to musical oral testimonies will enable a, quote, bearing witness to some forgotten wound, as Kathy Caruth puts it, and opens up the possibility of decoding the layers of meaning and resistance woven into these songs, testimonies, and texts, empowering and giving voice to the Romani people and their history. Testimony has the power to evoke historical trauma, reforming the past trauma into a present embodied or lived social fact. And I say here with Caruth that this requires, quote, a new mode of seeing and a new mode of listening, a seeing and a listening from the site of trauma. What we see and hear resonates beyond what we can know and understand, but it is in the event of this incomprehension and in our departure from sense and understanding that our own witnessing may indeed begin to take place, end quote. The task of listening through trauma is Sisyphean. However, critically listening with attention and care to the testimonies of Holocaust survivors is necessary in order for these embodied archives of trauma to enact their power to transmit knowledge. I want to invite all of us to think about listening as a critical act of deep care. As things stand in our global society today, we cannot hear the Roma. Their history, their suffering, both historical and contemporary, remain without ears to listen. Listening, truly listening, actively listening, not passively hearing, is to tune into the struggles, the life stories, the everyday challenges, and the historical legacies of trauma of another human being. Listening is care. Listening begets empathy. What more can we do to make ourselves heard? When we critically listen, we hear Romani subjectivity. Who is the Roma subject we hear through the archive? If we can listen across testimonies, a Romani figure emerges in our mind's ear. What does this subject sound like? What kind of sounds does this subject make? Is the subject allowed to make? Can the subaltern speak? Can she sing? Can she dance, as Dina asked of Celine? Will we listen to the subaltern? Can we center the voices so that we don't continually reinscribe the marginalization inherent in the label subaltern? These may seem like abstract rhetorical questions, but they distinguish the meaningful difference between bare life and not, between a subject who is in a state of social death, what John Mohammed calls the death-bound subject, and one who is alive. The act of speaking, of singing, is a radical act of resistance to being silenced, muted, and erased. And the act of listening to the subaltern speak is an act of acknowledgement and recognition that paves a pathway to empathy. We should consider listening as a practice, a ritual really, that not only reminds us but affects us. Affect and emotion are powerful tools that are regularly used in espousing fascist ideologies, xenophobia, and hate. But affective remembrance can catalyze change. The practice of listening to the Roma has the power to broaden horizons of understanding, to quote Gadamer, to create meeting points in our fractured schemas. It is through gaps of misinformation that Roma, their stories, their subjectivity slip through. But in making listening, critical, active listening, a practice, we may succeed in closing those gaps, and not only making Roma voices and histories heard, but radically changing the ignorance that colors current perception of Romani life. Through a politics of listening, both testimony and historical understanding emerges. A politics of listening, as Laub describes it, is a contract that emphasizes recognizing and meeting, quote, the gaping, vertiginous black hole of the experience of trauma, end quote. Such a contract acknowledges that by listening, we become implicated in the traumatic event. Lack of listening and lack of recognition results in a double trauma. As Keenan explains, on the one hand, there is a cataclysmic event, which produces symptoms and calls for testimony. And then it happens again when the value of the witness in the testimony is denied, and there is no one to attend to or respond to the event, but to witness it as well. So a double trauma is a trauma unrecognized. It is a trauma unheard or unlistened to. Thus, critical listening has the power to curtail re-traumatization through recognition of trauma that has been repeatedly unheard. Each example I've taken us through today is a different deployment of critical listening. With Dina, we listened through friendship. With Lena, through the sonically injurious children's song as mediated through her memory. Emilie demonstrated how we can listen through musical histories encoded in melody, which offers survivors the chance of preserving counter-memories, even if only at the level of private transcripts. Finally, Agnieszka offered listening as a carving out of affective emotional space for intimate appreciation of Romani life and culture. In this case, she was moved to tears watching her family members perform unapologetically, markedly Romani music. It's a music of resistance, as it's music made in the wake of genocide. It is a resistance to the erasure that the Nazis attempted. To close, I would like to point to listening as a political act. Listening has the potential not only to curtail re-traumatization on a metaphorical level of memory, but also in a literal sense. Rising neo-Nazism in Europe has made Roma life vulnerable to ethno-racial murder once again. Violent and deadly neo-Nazi pogroms in Ukraine have claimed the lives of Roma in recent months. And this is but one example of rising anti-Roma sentiment across Europe. I won't pretend that a methodology of critical listening can change the tide of fascism. But as Caruth states, even in the face of the impossibility of listening to traumatic experience, the only option we have is to try. Just as Dina shrugged her shoulders in uncertainty when asked about why painting Celine mattered to her, the only response I can give to the question, why should we listen critically, is because we must. Because it's what makes us human. Dina paints Celine because she loved her, because Celine was her friend. And we must critically listen in order to rebel against the cruelty of the past and of the present. Thank you.
So the floor is open for questions now.
Let me start. I have lived among gypsies in this city for many years, and in listening to their language, it left no doubt that they left from India, because my mother tongue, their language has many similar words. So they don't send their kids to school. And when I asked them why, the answer was because they will lose their culture, which is kind of true, because when you go to schooling, you assimilate with the culture of the society at large. So it is very rare to see a gypsy or Roma educated, let alone highly educated like you. So my question to you is, was your family exception to the rule, or there's something changing?
I don't really know where to start other than to say that, yes, Roma are from India. The language is very similar to, it's very close to Bangladeshi and Hindi. The term gypsy is a pejorative term. We don't use that to refer to ourselves. Oftentimes Roma will call themselves, okay, yes, I am Roma, that's true. But I don't really feel like addressing the rest of the question, if that's okay.
All right.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes?
You may have addressed this in the beginning, in which case I apologize, I came in late. But I just wanted to know what the access to music was like on the ground, where Roma people were being held. Obviously, there were different populations in different times, in different places, but like in camp specifically, obviously access to musical instruments would have been pretty small, I'm assuming. So I was just wondering if you could.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So this sort of history of the discipline of ethnomusicology and musicology as it pertains to Roma Holocaust songs is very, very limited. So we don't have the same like vast amount of information that we have in terms of the Jewish experience with musical culture in camps. And so that's a long way of saying that I don't really know the answer to your question, because we just don't have really concrete documentation about it. I can say from my own experience of speaking to Holocaust survivors in the context of Romania, as far as I know, in the concentration camp in northern Romania, there were not musical instruments. That's not, everything that people owned was confiscated before they arrived at the camp. But it's a really great question that I hope we somehow are able to piece together. Yeah, thank you.
You brought up like silencing testimony or experiences, and you addressed kind of the Soviet bloc or Soviet experiences. I found it very interesting, and I know very little about it. I'm coming from the outside, but outside the Soviet context, for example, Roma living in France or Germany or elsewhere outside the Soviet bloc. Do you know of any, like the trajectory of experience that a Roma, post-Holocaust Roma survivor, or that the community would have to deal with, or what can you say about other nation states or other states where Roma?
Again, yeah, my experience again is really focused on Romania, but what happens in Romania is also true of Roma experience of being silenced in a variety of ways. The sort of the worst, I guess, manifestation of this is in the Romanian context, the denial of reparations of Roma survivors. So this is something that I've been working with a group of other activists on for a number of years. This law that was passed in Romania in 1999, which was the first sort of recognition on the part of the government of the genocide, promised survivors, both Jewish and Roma, reparations in a variety of forms. And the Roma survivors that this group works with, there's a handful of people who are denied these reparations, and the way in which the law is written is extremely bureaucratic, such that these folks have almost no chance of reaching these requirements. You have to demonstrate that you were deported, but also that you returned from the camp with some kind of archival documentation, which is really difficult for people who, after the war ended, they just left on foot. You know, there was no documentation of their liberation from the camp. In sort of a broader scale, we see across, I sort of touch on this, museums, exhibits, commemorations, that Roma are not included in these events. Again, another example from the Romanian context is last year for International Commemoration Day on January 27th, Klaus Iohannis, the president of Romania, decorated survivors of the Holocaust, and Roma were not only not decorated, they weren't even invited to the event. So after that happened, a group of activists wrote a letter to the president, and this year we got our own event where there were survivors decorated. And so I think there's change happening. There's descendants of survivors, folks like me I'm not a descendant of a survivor, but I'm impassioned by this problem. We're rallying together and trying to change that lack of representation. Yes, Sandra.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it a lot. So I wanted to ask you, were any of the testimonies that you reviewed indexed? And if so, what was your reaction to the indexing terms that were used? And what kind of indexing terms could we maybe think about incorporating to address some of the scholarly research that's being done right now with you and your colleagues in this area?
Yeah, thank you for the question. My experience using the archive was, and the indexing terms, was very pleasant. I was very pleasantly surprised, and I think Crispin is to thank for this. I assume the nuance to the indexing terms related to Roma. So a lot of them were, paragraph-long descriptions that really got into the issues, but in a really sensitive way. I think that the terms that exist are very helpful. Like, I found these clips using a combination of Roma culture, musical recitals, anti-Roma prejudice, these terms that were really helpful. As far as my experience of using the archive, I can't think now of particular terms that would be helpful. Aside from this, the testimonies, there are a handful that are not indexed and that are not transcribed that would probably be helpful to have. Like the Romani testimonies index might help open up more research on this topic in the future. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. My question to you, it's been wonderful having you here with us doing your research over the past few weeks, and it's made me painfully aware of the fact that this is an experience group that I, either personally or professionally, haven't done much in for a variety of reasons. And I think that's to my detriment and probably all of us who work at the Shoah Foundation's detriment. So, as sort of the gatekeepers of the VHA, what's your suggestion to us on how we can be better listeners?
I think Jenna and I met yesterday and talked about Eyewitness, and there were some really specific things with that platform that could help bring this sort of silenced history more into the light. And something as simple as just putting the experience group at the top on the header so that people just see it and click on it. That's one thing. I honestly, maybe it's because I come from like a history of having, of struggling to argue for the validity of the Romani Holocaust, that I've had such a pleasant experience here, that it's hard. I really don't have like strong critiques to make towards the VHA. I was very impressed to find out from Martha and from Kim and other folks that the collection of Romani testimony started as early as like 1999 or something, 1998, which is very surprising, very good, like good on the Shoah Foundation for that. So I think, yeah, just more sort of curated materials that are publicly available are really helpful, because when these testimonies are still buried and hidden and sort of, encrypted in these ways that aren't accessible to people, then we're not, giving them the power to speak in the way that we could. But I'm so happy to collaborate with you and other people at the Institute on this, and I know other people who would be as well. Yeah, Ida.
Do you find that there should be more indexing terms that are just focused on the Roma, Sinti Roma experience? Because what I find interesting is that you were able to get to a lot of the Sinti and Roma through what happened to the Jewish experience. So you were able to get to some of them. So is your recommendation that we do more, Sinti, and that we focus more for the indexing terms that are straight to that experience, or are the indexing terms that you are finding there, will they suffice to get users to those experiences?
I found that the indexing was done so thoroughly that even in a testimony of a Jewish survivor, just a mention of Roma culture or Roma people or anti-Roma, it was indexed. So maybe it's less about the particular terms, but like how they're being employed. And I really found that they were. I obviously I don't know what it is that I missed because I didn't see those things, but what I did find I felt like was very a vast amount of things. Like these are just a selection of many testimonies that are from Jewish survivors about Roma, but then also Roma. I think the barrier for me was less, I found the testimonies, it was more the lack of indexing in languages like the Italian Roma and Sinti. Those were pretty sparsely indexed. So when I did come across it, it was hard for me to get a sense of what the person was saying just from the terms, because I kind of understand Italian, but not enough to be able to use it in a presentation. But I think if we want these Roma testimonies to be used more, I think it's more about the transcribing, and it's the language barrier, especially the Romani ones. It's the language barrier, yeah.
Could I ask you,
Yeah.
country, you found to have more authentic experience, the Scythian Roma experience?
So there was a good portion of Italian, there was Ukrainian, a lot of Russian, another language I don't speak. But I think Ukrainian and Russian were the highest. There's only 7 Romanian survivors, Roma Romanian survivors, 4 of which are in Romanes, 3 are in Romanian. So yeah, I think predominantly Ukrainian and Russian. Yeah. Anyway. My fellow ethnomusicologists.
So my first question is, so this one song that you had, I think it was your second or third example about melody.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious if that's part of wider practice of setting these narratives about the Holocaust to existing melodies, and is that only related to Romania, but or it can also be traced in other countries of Eastern Europe? And my second question is really about resistance, because you do talk about, very performance of music, of this Romani music, as an act of resistance. So I'm wondering, about you drawing parallels with the scholarship on music as resistance in the Holocaust as a whole, especially when it comes to the Jewish experience, because we know that nowadays there's some criticism about, music as a form of spiritual resistance of that context. So I'm wondering about, your thoughts about that, and how do you situate your thinking about this music as resistance with that?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Thank you. The first question. So the song that Emilia sings is a Czech Romani folk song, and then the 2 Holocaust songs that they come after, that are based on this song, and this practice of using pre-existing melodies, I think, is pretty widespread, although I only can give one other example, which is in the case of my research with Romanian Roma, there's a song, it's called Cântec, it's Song of the Deported Roma of Romania. And the singer who I learned the song from doesn't know where the melody came from, because she, in her interview with me, she said that she heard the song in the barracks in Transnistria, in the concentration camp. So it was like the neighboring house or whatever they had, she heard the song, and then she's the one who brought it out, but she didn't compose it. And then when I played the recording to Roma musicians who were, Bucharest professional musicians who are Roma, I asked them, what do you make of this melody? Where does this come from? And they thought it was a 1950s, 1960s popular tune. And so there's a big question mark there then, because you wonder, did Alexandrina remember the words to the song and then hear a melody and then put those 2 things together? So the sort of, I guess the anachronistic nature of that, it kind of opens up a new question about, the origin of the melody. But then there's another song that has no pre-existing melody whatsoever. And that one's called Cimitir Romano. That's a song that, when you listen to it, it kind of sounds like a sing-songy. It doesn't have a melodic shape in the way that Chaya Romani does. So you also have Holocaust survivors who are not musicians at all. They're not professional musicians. They might not have musical training, which is not the case for Emilia. She comes from a musician family. But using music and text to create these kind of archives or documents of that memory, even though they might not be musicians necessarily. And then your second question is something I struggle with a lot. My dissertation used to be called Sonic Resistance. And then I realized that there was a video game with Sonic the Hedgehog that was called Sonic Resistance. And then I also realized that there is this big ethnomusicological debate around, you know, what we like to claim because it's convenient for our arguments as music that's music of resistance, and how, you know, the practitioners actually see it. And I left that term for a while, and then I'm sort of coming back to it now, and we were sort of talking about this over lunch, when I just became so struck, like in awe, by the fact that these people still sing this music, even though it was a thing that marked them as Romani, and being Romani meant you could be sent to your death. The fact that they do it feels like a political act. It feels like a proclamation saying, I'm here and I'm Romani and I'm not going to hide it, because they're singing it. They're putting that out there through playing this music that it cannot be confused as anything but Romani music. Which is why I'm kind of coming back into using that term, but I'm not 100% sure about it. Thanks for the question. Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk and this kind of very interesting elaboration on listening. And you evoked kind of the work, let the subaltern speak, right? And at some point you said something like we should have this kind of subaltern listening. And I wonder, was this just kind of a side remark, or is there more to it what you are thinking about?
It's definitely a very preliminary kind of concept that I'd like to flesh out more, but it sort of goes back to how I started out talking about there's a culture of silence. That's how we talk about the Romani Holocaust. And then that puts the onus on survivors to speak. And so then I was trying to relate it back to this spivak, can the subaltern speak? But even in that framework, you know, the person who's acting is still the subaltern agent. It's still their responsibility to speak. And we can speak all we want, but if nobody's listening, like, what is it going to do? So the idea of I guess it should be, can we listen to the subaltern, not can the subaltern listen? But, you know, it's a sort of inversion of that, you know.
Just to follow up,
yeah.
I think it is sometimes hard for other people to understand that you have to make a case here, right, for the silencing of population and the fate of the population. It reminds me when I visited in DC, the two museums, the African American Museum and the Native American Museum. There's a vastly different kind of difference in what kind of statement they make. And especially the Native American make a similar statement as you say. It's kind of saying, we are here, we actually lived through this, we are still here. And while the African American Museum has very different kind of agenda, it doesn't need to make this statement. And so I think this is sometimes people forget that there are different discourses, and one is really kind of in the very margin, while, let's say, the Jewish Holocaust is very center.
Yeah. I saw one other hand. Gabor, did you have a question?
Yeah. So if I remember well, Spivak said that the subaltern cannot speak.
But then she later published something else where she said that they can.
But I'm wondering, can subaltern speak through music? What is the role of music in giving voice to the subaltern?
Yeah, I think that's kind of you're honing in on the sort of thesis of my dissertation, which is about music as sources of counterhistories for Roma. And so when you know, the written archive of primary sources and written texts on history and these wide large historical narratives leave out a population like the Roma, where, you know, Foucault asks this question of where does when he coins the term counter histories and counter memories, he asks this question of, you know, well, where do we look for these? And he says it's from the side of darkness, of, you know, all these metaphorical languages, but maybe it's in oral forms, you know, maybe it's in repertoires that aren't written down. And with the Roma Holocaust, again, my expertise is really in Romania. We really find that to be true. Until recently, there haven't been, you know, historical monographs written on the Roma Holocaust, but there are 6 songs, and there's probably plenty more that we were not able to record before the survivors passed away. But there are songs that actually do serve this function of preserving from a first-hand perspective. So in that case, then the subaltern can speak through music. Yeah, that's an example. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.